Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday night, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Quick reminder, class tomorrow, special time, 10 a.m. Pacific, so that we can make a siyum. We saved the last passage of Tractate Nazir, so we can make a siyum tomorrow. And those like me who are a firstborn celebrate making a siyum on a tractate. Then we can make a meal, Sudas mitzvah, right? Mitzvah meal at the end of completing the tractate, and then that overrides the custom, not the law, to fast of the first fast of the firstborn on Erev Pesach. Recall when we read Tractate Pesachim, the generally accepted law is if one has to work. We should try to avoid doing any work tomorrow, but if one has to work, generally it's accepted until noon and no work beyond that. In your locality, there's the time at which you stop eating chametz, at the time at which you stop owning chametz. You have to have declared it ownerless, usually make an arrangement to sell any chametz, and then declare that anything that is in your possession is not in your possession. And then we can't eat matzah until Passover comes in tomorrow night, and it's part of the Seder. Who's with us? Looks like a lot of people are getting ready for Passover today. Paula in Chicago, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck. Over on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Joe in Massachusetts, Debbie, I can't believe Pesach is almost here, Hag Sameach from Toms River, New Jersey. And we wish everybody a Hag Kasher v'Sameach. Right, so we always wish each other a Freilikin or a Sameach or a happy Yom Tov, a happy holiday. But with Passover, we also say kasher, that it should be kosher, right? Meaning that there won't be any chametz found on our property, that we won't eat any chametz, not on purpose and not by accident. And as I learned from Mark Mandelbaum, what you're actually saying is, since a person, if his health demanded it, could eat chametz, right, to save his life on Passover. When you wish somebody a kosher Pesach, you're saying you should have a healthy Pesach. So may everybody have a Hag Kasher v'Sameach, a kosher and happy Passover. Let's get into it. Our daf today is Sotah, daf Vav, page 6. Here in Tractate Sotah, the 18th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 1. Today continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2. And we shall reach Mishna number 3 today, I believe, or is it tomorrow? Tomorrow we'll reach Mishna number 3. Okay, we picked this up right at the top, right near the top of page 6a. And there were those who say that Rav Yosef said differently. At the end of yesterday, we were discussing, what happens so who's the Sotah, the suspected adulteress? How does she become a Sotah? Her husband warned her in the presence of two witnesses, don't seclude yourself with such and such that particular man. And then in the presence of two witnesses, she secluded herself with that particular man. At that point, she and the husband become prohibited to each other until she drinks the bitter water at the temple, the holy temple in Jerusalem. The temple hasn't stood in 2,000 years. That's why you don't want to initiate the Sotah process, because there's no way out. If she is innocent, she drinks the bitter water, she'll be fine, and then the husband and wife will become permitted to each other again. But if she becomes a Sotah and does not or cannot drink the bitter water, the husband and the wife will remain prohibited to each other, and they have no other option but to divorce. Now, what happens if she becomes a Sotah? Right, so she's warned in front of two witnesses, secluded in front of two witnesses. Now they need to go to Jerusalem and drink the bitter water if they want to stay together. But before that can happen, he dies. What happens then? So if he dies and he has no child, and he has a brother, so then Yibum becomes applicable, that she could marry his brother in the normal course of things, or they can opt out of that and perform the ritual of chalitza. That's under normal circumstances when a married man dies childless and leaves a brother, as we learned in Tractate Yevamos. But what about if the wife in that situation is a Sotah? Is she going to marry the brother? So we read, and there are those who say that Rav Yosef said differently. The verse calls a man who marries a woman after she was divorced from her first husband due to suspicion of adultery, another man. As the verse states, Deuteronomy 24:2, and she departs out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. This indicates that one who subsequently marries her is not a peer, P-E-E-R, right? Like, in other words, he's not on the same level as the guy who married when the first husband, right? He married his wife. Yeah, presumably, she was either a widow, a divorcee, or a single woman who was never married, but not under any kind of suspicion. They married. She became a Sotah, and let's say she doesn't drink the bitter waters, and then they divorce. So now she was a woman who was divorced under this cloud of suspicion. She's free to marry another man, but is it advisable to marry this woman who's under a cloud of suspicion? This indicates that the second husband is not a peer of her first husband, because this one, the first husband, removed an evil woman from his house, and that one brought an evil woman into his house. There is an implied criticism of the second husband in the verse, and yet you say that the verse instructs that she should also enter into levirate marriage, right? So a second husband should marry her. Well, what about the brother? Now we're going to say that the brother should perform yibum? That seems inappropriate. So Abaye said to him, if that is so, then if she married another man and he died without children, then she should not enter into levirate marriage, right, into yibum with the brother of the second husband, even if she did not commit adultery during the second marriage, since the verse calls the second husband another man, which excluded the possibility of yibum. So Rav Yosef answered Abaye, with regard to that one, i.e. the second husband, at least she remained with a good name. Since she did not engage in illicit behavior during her second marriage, she can enter into yibum, levirate marriage, with the brother of the second husband if she was widowed twice, or at least widowed from the second marriage. She was widowed from the first marriage also because she was a Sotah, and then before she drank the bitter waters, he died, right? And then another man marries her. Now there's no reason to have, maybe he should have thought twice before marrying her, but he did. And then there's no, suspicion of illicit behavior during the second marriage. So even though she was not permitted to perform yibum with the brother of the first husband that she was a widow of, she would be permitted with the brother of the husband to whom she was widowed in the second marriage. So Rava says a different reason why a Sotah cannot enter into yibum. This prohibition can be deduced through a kal v'chomer inference. If, due to the suspicion of adultery, she becomes forbidden to the one who was previously permitted to her, meaning her first husband, right? Once she becomes a Sotah, she and her husband are prohibited to each other. Her husband, of course, had been permitted to her. Now he becomes prohibited when she's a Sotah. He will only become permitted to her again if she drinks the bitter water. But he died in the meantime. So he was permitted, he became prohibited. Then, with regard to one who was forbidden to her, meaning the husband's brother, is it not all the more so that she remained forbidden to him? A guy who was permitted to her became prohibited. Why would a guy who had been prohibited, her husband's brother, become permitted? He should stay prohibited, according to this reasoning of Rava. So Abaye said to him, if that is so, if this kal v'chomer reasoning is the basis of the prohibition against her entering into yibum, then in the case of a high priest who betrothed a widow, which he is prohibited from doing, right? A priest can marry a widow. A high priest, a Kohen Gadol, cannot marry a widow, right? Neither one of them, neither a priest nor a high priest can marry a divorcee, but a high priest cannot even marry a widow. He can only marry a woman who was never married. So if a high priest betrothed a widow, and to betroth has the same legal significance as to marry, so he made a transgression when he did that. So if a high priest betrothed a widow, which he is prohibited from doing, and he died before the marriage took place, and he has a brother who is a Kohen, a common priest, who is permitted to marry a widow, so she should still not be permitted to enter into yibum with this brother, the regular priest, since the same inference could be stated. If she becomes forbidden to the one who was permitted to her, i.e. her husband, the high priest, who was prohibited from marrying a widow, then with regard to one who was forbidden to her because he was the brother of the original husband, right? You can never marry your husband's brother even when your husband dies, unless the husband dies childless, and then we have a yibum situation. Otherwise, she can't marry the brother of her former husband who died. So, therefore, you would think that this woman who became prohibited to the high priest because she was a divorcee, how can she become permitted to his brother? She was prohibited to the brother because it was the brother of the man she betrothed. Now is she going to become permitted to him after she was prohibited to, the one who died, the high priest? But the Gemara refutes this inference. It's not a good comparison. In the case of the high priest, can one say she becomes forbidden? But she was always forbidden to him because she was a widow. She never had a time when she was permitted to the high priest due to the... Can one say she becomes forbidden? But she was forbidden to him and remains forbidden to him. She did not become forbidden to her husband, the high priest, due to the marriage. Furthermore, in the case of the high priest, can one say permitted to her? But the high priest is forbidden to her always. Therefore, the case of the high priest does not serve as a refutation of this Kal V'chomer inference that since, just in the regular course of things, that she was permitted to a regular husband who wasn't a priest. It was her husband. She was permitted to him. And then she became a Sotah, so she was prohibited to him. All the more so she should now not then become permitted to his brother once this man dies. She had been prohibited to him she had been prohibited to the brother as her brother-in-law. And she remains prohibited to him when he becomes her Yavama. Rather, they need to perform Chalitza. So rather, a better refutation is like this. In the case of a regular priest's wife who was raped, who becomes forbidden to her husband, right? This is one of those very sad things that you find in halacha. If a regular Jew or even a Levite, right? I'm a Levite, so like the descendants of Levi, who would be sort of assistants to the priest, for anyone who's not a Kohen, right? Whether he's a Levite or a regular Yisrael, just any Jew, right? The common run-of-the-mill male Jew. If his wife, God forbid, is raped, that's not her fault. She didn't do anything wrong, and she and her husband remain permitted to each other after the rape. However, a priest, because he's consecrated and held to such a high level so that he can serve in the temple, if his wife has sex with anyone that's not him, she becomes prohibited to him. Even though she did nothing wrong when she was raped, she can marry any other Jew, but she cannot be married to a priest because of this tragedy. So, in the case of a priest's wife who was raped, who becomes forbidden to her husband, and then her husband dies, and he has a brother who is a priest, but this brother who is a priest, so you'd think, well, how does the brother is any different than the original husband? They're both Kohanim, right? They're both priests. So why would she be any more permitted to this surviving brother? And the answer is because the first brother was a qualified priest, and the second brother, the surviving brother, was a disqualified priest, known as a halal. What disqualified him? For instance, he had some kind of a physical blemish that disqualified him from serving as a priest in the temple. If so, then she can marry him, right? Then we remove that obstacle. And so, this woman who was raped, who cannot marry a priest who's qualified to serve, can marry a priest who's been disqualified from serving. You would think, right? So rather, the refutation could go like this. In the case of a priest's wife who was raped, who becomes forbidden to her husband, and then her husband dies, and he has a brother who is a priest, not disqualified due to a physical blemish, but disqualified due to flawed lineage. So this would be something like they're both brothers, but they're half brothers. They're brothers of the same sons of the same father, but with different mothers. And this one that's a halal, probably because his father, who was a priest, married somebody who was unfit for him. Like, for instance, he married a divorcee that he's not permitted to do. So his son is a disqualified Kohen. His son is a halal. this halal is not bound by the restrictions of marriage given to a priest, then she should not be permitted to enter into levirate marriage with him. If she becomes forbidden to the one who was permitted to her, i.e. her husband, the priest, then with regard to the one who was forbidden to her, not because he's a disqualified priest, but because he's the brother of her husband, so that's why he was forbidden to her, then her husband died childless, is she now then going to become permitted to this brother-in-law, right? She's permitted to him in terms of the rape has no bearing on the fact that she can marry this surviving brother who is a halal. But if we just accept this regular principle that a sotah who becomes prohibited to her husband then is going to remain prohibited to his brother if the husband dies childless. Are we going to apply the same principle here in the case of a priest's wife who becomes prohibited to him because she was raped? Is she going to remain prohibited to his brother even though that same type of prohibition doesn't apply to the brother? The fact that the woman was forbidden to her halal brother-in-law while she was married to her husband is immaterial. This is because had she been raped while she was married to the halal, it would not render her forbidden to him, as he had the status of an Israelite with regard to marriage. Consequently, this case cannot be compared to the case of the Mishna, as a woman who commits adultery is forbidden to any husband, not only a priest. So we can't use that example to refute that by that Kal V'chomer, to refute the Kal V'chomer. And actually, that's where the discussion ends, because now we're moving on to, we were discussing Mishnah number 1, and that is the end of Mishnah number 1. Now we move on to Mishnah number 2. And these are women who, despite being married to priests, are prohibited from partaking of teruma due to suspicion of adultery, right? So remember that who can eat teruma, food consecrated for the use of priests, right? It's part of the tithing process that some of the first 2% of a farmer's crop in the land of Israel goes to a priest or to the priests. And that is teruma, and that's holy food that only priests can eat. But a priest's wife can eat it, a priest's children can eat it, even though a priest's sons are priests, but a priest's daughters are not priests, and a priest's wife is not a priest, but they can partake of his food. Not only that, a Canaanite slave in a priest's household can eat teruma, even though they're not Jewish, whereas a regular Yisrael or even a Levite cannot eat teruma. So members of a priest's household can eat teruma. However, a Sotah, that's the wife of a priest, can she continue to eat teruma? Right? These women who, despite being married to priests, are prohibited from partaking of teruma due to suspicion of adultery. Who are they? A woman who says to her husband, I am defiled to you. In other words, she admitted to having committed adultery with another man. And in a case where witnesses came forth and testified that she is defiled. Now, this is not a sotah, right? A sotah is the warning in front of 2 witnesses, don't seclude yourself with that man. And then in front of 2 witnesses, she secludes herself with that particular man, and then she becomes a sotah. This is something else. This is either of her own volition, she told her husband, I cheated on you, or 2 witnesses came and said to him, we saw this woman, defile herself, cheat on you with some guy. So this is not a sotah, but here, either by her own admission or the testimony of 2 witnesses, this woman has committed adultery, and therefore she's still married to him, but she cannot eat teruma. And she won't be married to him for long. After that admission of the testimony of 2 witnesses, the next step is going to be a divorce. Right, so a woman who says to her husband, I am defiled to you, i.e. she admitted committing adultery, and in a case where witnesses, plural, came forth and testified that she is defiled. And third case, a woman who says, after a warning and seclusion, I will not drink the bitter water of a sotah, right? So this is a woman who is a sotah and says, I don't want to drink the bitter water for whatever reason, right? Perhaps because she's guilty. And so she doesn't want to go through the ordeal of drinking the bitter water. And in a case where her husband does not want to force her to drink the water, even after she secluded herself with another man after his warning, and also in a case where her husband engaged in sexual intercourse with her on the way to bringing her to the temple to drink the bitter water. As in such a case, the water will not be effective in evaluating whether she was unfaithful due to the husband's own prohibited act. Maybe this husband wasn't so innocent himself, and she went and cheated on him, and now they're on their way to Jerusalem for her to drink the bitter water, and it might be that she actually committed the act, and so her life is in danger. And now the husband's like, you know what, let's make up. Let's kiss and make up. So at that point, if they now they're prohibited to each other, but they transgress and they lie together. So now she is disqualified from drinking the bitter water. She can no longer drink the bitter water because the husband and wife came back together. The bitter water doesn't apply anymore. Now, in all these cases, they might decide to stay together, and there's a violation of law in that. You're supposed to divorce a wife who cheats on you, but maybe they don't do that. But if he's a priest, she can no longer partake of teruma in all of these cases. That's the Mishnah number 2. The Gemara. Rav Amram says, Rav Sheshes told us this matter, and he enlightened our eyes for us by citing support for this statement from the Mishnah. In the case of a Sotah, the suspected adulteress, for whom there are witnesses concerning her in a country overseas, who can testify that she engaged in sexual intercourse, the bitter water of a Sotah does not evaluate whether or not she was unfaithful. Now, this is very interesting. And in all this ensuing discussion that comes now, we see that what is the purpose of the Sotah ritual is that she is a suspected adulteress. No one saw her commit an act of sexual intercourse with her alleged lover, right? She was given a warning not to seclude herself with that man in front of 2 witnesses, and then those 2 or some other 2 witnesses saw that she secluded herself with that particular man that she was warned about. And then we don't know what happened behind closed doors. Only she knows and the man who was with her knows, and neither of them counts as witnesses. So in that situation, and she claims nothing happened, but because she violated the terms of the warning and secluded herself, that's why she and her husband become prohibited to each other, and they don't become permitted again until she goes and drinks the better water at the temple when the temple is standing. But if there were 2 witnesses, whether they come and testify or not, right? Because maybe this whole thing happened in some other country far away, and then the husband and wife go to Israel to perform the ceremony, but that ceremony won't prove anything. Because the ceremony only exists, right? The ritual as defined in the Torah only exists as, in a sense, for heaven to step in and miraculously testify that she's innocent or that she's guilty. But heaven, as it were, will only do that in the absence of the possibility of witness testimony. So if she was actually witnessed doing the sexual act, or I guess not doing it, but there are witnesses who could testify as to that action, then the test won't work. The test is actually inapplicable, and it won't work. And therefore, it should not be done. And the reason that it should not be done, except to create harmony between a husband and wife, or to result in this adulteress receiving the penalty that she dies if she cheated on the husband and then drinks the bitter water, she'll die. But if she didn't cheat, she will live. But the reason we don't want to do this unless there's no other choice is because the ritual itself in the temple involves writing the verses about this subject from the Torah on a parchment in ink that is loose, as it were. And so the parchment and the ink goes in the water. The actual bitter water that she's going to drink has the parchment with the ink on it. And when the ink dissolves into the water, that has the effect of erasing God's name, because God's name is included in these verses. And so we don't ever want to be in a situation where God's name is written and we erase it. So God is so humble that God allows God's name to be erased for the purpose of creating peace in the home, right? Reuniting the husband and wife. But if there's, if there were witnesses to this thing and it could have been done with witness testimony, then the test won't work and it should not be done because we don't want to erase God's name unnecessarily, in vain, as it were. right? So if there were witnesses concerning her, they're just not here, they're not present, they're in a country overseas, but they exist in the world, witnesses who can testify that she did engage in sexual intercourse, then the bitter water of the Sotah, which would otherwise kill her because she's guilty, won't kill her because witnesses could have testified. The bitter water of the Sotah does not evaluate whether or not she was unfaithful if there are witnesses concerning her immoral behavior and they're just not present here. They're somewhere overseas. Although she did commit adultery, the water evaluates her fidelity only when there is no possibility of proving her guilt in court. What is the reason for this? It is as the verse states, and a man lie with her carnally, and it was hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she was defiled secretly, and there was no witness against her. Numbers 5:13. And this indicates that the bitter water is given only when there is no one who knows about her action, to the exclusion of the case of this woman who is not given the bitter water, because there are those who know about her. And Rav Sheshes enlightened our eyes for us by adducing support for this ruling from the Mishna, as it teaches. And where witnesses came and testified that she is defiled, this is one of the women who can no longer partake of teruma. And Rav Sheshes asks, this is a case where the witnesses came when? When did the witnesses come? If we say that they came before she drank, then what is novel about the fact that it is prohibited for her to partake of teruma? She is a woman who had sexual relations with a man forbidden to her by the Torah. She's a zona, a confirmed adulteress, and it is obviously prohibited for her to partake of teruma. So Rav Sheshes continues, rather, it must be referring to a case where the witnesses testified after she had already drunk the bitter water. Right? So imagine that she drank the bitter water and she was fine. Right? So she must be innocent. And then two witnesses come forward and say, no, she committed sexual adultery and we saw her. Now we have a big problem. Huge problem, right? Because now this throws into question the whole sort of miraculous aspect of the ordeal. That the ordeal is, if she's innocent, she survives. If she's guilty, she's going to miraculously die right then and there. So now two witnesses come and say, well, no, actually, she did commit the act. We don't know why she survived the ordeal, but we saw that she had sex with a man who was not her husband. So what are we to understand from this, right? So there's a couple possibilities here. One is the witnesses are lying. They could be a case of conspiring witnesses who conspired to testify falsely about her. Which, by the way, because, this could be a death penalty offense for her, it would become a death penalty offense for the conspiring witnesses. Or it's this, right? Because the witnesses exist, no, the ordeal, she drank water, but it was never going to do anything to her because the witnesses exist who could testify about it. Right? So if the witnesses come after she had already drunk, so granted, if you say that the bitter water of a Sotah does not evaluate her in a case where there are witnesses elsewhere who can testify with regard to her infidelity, then all is well. But if you say that the water evaluates her in a case where there are witnesses elsewhere who can't testify with regard to her infidelity, then it should be revealed retroactively that they are false witnesses, as the fact that she survived the drinking of the bitter water would indicate that she never committed adultery. So Rav Yosef said to Rav Sheshes, well, actually, I will say to you that the bitter water evaluates her in a case where there are witnesses elsewhere who can testify with regard to her infidelity, right? Rav Yosef says, it doesn't matter if there are witnesses or not, the waters will work, right? So if she is innocent, it's because, if she doesn't die after drinking the bitter waters, it's because she is innocent. If these witnesses come up and testify that she actually did commit the act, then either they're liars or they're mistaken, right? It could be that they saw that, she was huddled up close to this man and they assumed that she was having sex, but they didn't actually see the nitty gritty as it were. So they thought they saw what they saw, but they were wrong. And, we have all the time people come to court and testify about an incident and give different versions of the facts. And we don't have to assume that they're lying. We just can assume that they're testifying as to what they saw. And what they saw, depending on the perspective of where they were standing and looking from, might produce a different outcome. Right? So nevertheless, the fact that the woman survived the drinking of the water does not prove her innocence. And one can say that this woman who already drank had merit, says Rav Yosef. So this is a third possibility. He says, no, actually, she drank the water. She didn't die. The witnesses come and testify about her that she actually did the act. The waters are effective, says Rav Yosef. And the reason that she didn't die is because she hasn't died yet, right? In other words, that sometimes you drink the bitter water and it will be a miraculous death, because she was an adulteress. So heaven will step in and cause her to die, but it might not happen immediately, says Rav Yosef. There might be a delay. And what would cause that delay? Her merit, right? Okay, she committed adultery, but maybe she has a lot of other good things that she did in her life, and we shouldn't be so quick to define her by her worst moment, right? And maybe heaven won't define her that quickly. And so because she has other merit, she won't die that very moment. How long will the delay be? I'm not sure. It depends how much merit she has, and it depends whether, this theory of Rav Yosef is correct. Right? So according to some opinions, if an unfaithful woman has certain merits, she will not die immediately upon drinking the water. Therefore, if witnesses were to testify to her infidelity after she drank the water without dying, it is not clear that their testimony is false. Now, the Gemara explains, with regard to what principle do Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef disagree? Right? Rav Sheshet says basically if there are witnesses, then the waters don't work. Rav Yosef says if there are witnesses, the waters still work. And we can't be sure that if she doesn't die, that she was innocent. If these witnesses say that she was guilty, it might be that the waters work and the witnesses are right and that her death is delayed. Now, what are they actually disagreeing about? Well, with regard to whether she deteriorates, as explained by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as we learned in the Mishna that we'll encounter on page 22a, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says merit delays punishment with regard to the bitter water of a Sotah. Even if a woman actually committed adultery, she will not die immediately due to the merit that she has. But she will not give birth, and she will not improve in terms of her physical condition after having drunk the bitter water. Rather, she will progressively deteriorate until she ultimately dies in the same manner of death as suffered by a Sotah who drank the bitter water without having merit. Now, Rav Sheshet holds, both according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi, that she begins to deteriorate despite her merit. Therefore, if she doesn't begin to deteriorate immediately, the witnesses who testified subsequent to her drinking must be false witnesses. Not that the waters don't work if the witnesses exist, but rather the waters do work and the witnesses are liars. And Rav Yosef holds, only according to the opinion of Rebbe, is it so that she begins to deteriorate when she has merit. According to the opinion of the rabbis, she does not begin to deteriorate. Therefore, Rav Yosef explains that the mere fact that she survived the drinking of the bitter water and didn't begin deteriorating does not prove that the testimony was false. She might deteriorate later. So Rav Shimi Bar Ashi raises an objection from the aforementioned Mishna on 22a, which also teaches that Rabbi Shimon says merit does not delay punishment with regard to the bitter water of a Sotah. And if you say that merit delays punishment with regard to the bitter water, then, and here's Rabbi Shimon's reason, then you push aside the deterrent force of the bitter water before all the women who must drink it, as guilty women will rely on their merit to protect them from the immediate consequences. I don't know how strong a loss of deterrent that is, that they're not going to die immediately at that moment. They're going to die the next day, the next week, the next month. I mean, that seems like still a pretty strong deterrent. And furthermore, here's the bigger problem. You defame the untainted women who drank and survived. That's the real problem with this argument. Right? If you're going to say that women can drink the bitter water who are guilty and survive, either because there's witnesses somewhere else who know what she really did, or because she had some merit that will, preserve her for who knows how long, then all the women who were innocent had no other way to prove it to their husbands, so they drank the bitter water, survived the ordeal, and are, their innocence is now pristine. They're permitted to their husbands again. In fact, the Torah says they will bear children. Even women who hadn't borne children before will now bear children. But if you say that surviving the bitter water is not a proof of innocence, then you defame all these women who drank and survived, right? So that's the problem with this line of thinking. Says Rabbi Shimon, people will not view this as a proof of their innocence, and people will say, these women are defiled, but their merit delayed the punishment for them. So after quoting the statement of Rabbi Shimon, Rav Shimi bar Ashi now explains his objection. And if it is so that the bitter water of a Sotah does not evaluate the faithfulness of a woman about whom there are witnesses in a country overseas, then the same claim can be made as well. You defame the untainted women who drank and survived. People will not view this as proof of their innocence, but rather they will say, no, they are defiled, but there are witnesses about them somewhere else overseas, and that's the reason they survived the test. And the Gemara responds, do you say this according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? Indeed, according to Rabbi Shimon, from the same logic that merit does not delay punishment, witnesses in a country overseas do not delay it either. And Rav Sheshes would concede that his statement would not be accepted by Rabbi Shimon. Now, Rav raises an objection from the latter clause of the Mishnah there on 22a, which teaches, and these are the Sotah women whose meal offerings are burned and not offered on the altar, right? This is a different issue than women who cannot eat teruma because, they're married to a priest and then they became, accused by two witnesses of having, cheated, or they admitted that they cheated, or the other issues that we mentioned in our Mishnah. Here's something a little bit different, right? These are the Sotah women whose meal offerings are burned and not offered on the altar. One who says, I am defiled, and witnesses came forth and testified with regard to her that she is defiled. And Rav clarifies, in the case where witnesses came forth, when did they come forth? If we say, and we're on 6b now, if we say that they came forth before the meal offering was sanctified, as a meal offering becomes sanctified only when placed in the service vessels used in the temple service, then the testimony should obviate the need for the Sotah rite, and the meal offering should be transferred to a non-sacred status, as any meal offering that was found to be consecrated in error before it was sanctified in a service vessel reverts to non-sacred status. Therefore, Rav infers that the witnesses could not have testified before the offering's sanctification, or the meal offering would not be burned. Right? The law about this, one who says, I am defiled, if after the meal offering has been sanctified in a service vessel, the meal offering, right? The meal offering is like basically some flour mixed with oil, and I think it's some frankincense, which a portion of it is going to be burned on the altar, and the rest of it is going to be basically become bread that is given to priests to eat. That's the meal offering. I guess there's a meal offering that's part of the Sotah process. So, let's say that she's claiming her innocence and she's going to drink the waters. And so as part of that, she brings this meal offering. And then, before we actually finish the process, she says, you know what? I am defiled. I was defiled. I did commit adultery. But she has already set this, so she's not going to drink the bitter water, but she already put the meal offering in a service vessel in the temple, which consecrates it, right? So what are we going to do with that meal offering now? It's a very specific kind of question, but we can see that the implications of it have to do again with this timing of a woman. What happens when it is established that she was an adulteress, and at what point in the process does that happen? So, the law comes out like this. If after the meal offering has been sanctified in a service vessel, but before the handful was taken, a woman says, I am defiled to you, or if at that point witnesses testify that the woman had been defiled, the meal offering is burned in its entirety. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa, right? And where we are in our discussion of this particular law is we haven't got there that we're going to just disregard the meal offering and burn it. We're saying, well, maybe the meal itself just is deconsecrated, right? Because it was a mistaken offering because she wasn't innocent and it can't be brought. So where are we? So in a case where witnesses came forth, when did they come? If we say that they came forth before the meal offering was sanctified, right? It didn't go into the service vessel. It was just set aside for that. Okay, so then it should just be transferred to non-sacred status, as any meal offering that was found to be consecrated in error before it was sanctified in a service vessel just becomes non-sacred. Therefore, Rav infers that the witnesses could not have testified before the offering was sanctified by being placed in a service vessel in the temple, or the meal offering would not be burned, right? After it's sanctified, but then it turns out that it can't be brought to the altar, that's when we're just going to burn that meal offering. There's nothing because it can't be deconsecrated and it can't be offered up, so we burn it. Now, Rav states his objection. Rather, the witnesses must have come forth after the meal offering was sanctified. So granted, if you say the bitter water of a Sotah evaluates whether she was unfaithful in a case where there are witnesses to her infidelity, then even if they have not testified, evidently the meal offering is suitable to be sanctified and sacrificed. And when it was sanctified at the outset, although there were witnesses who could have testified, it was properly sanctified, and due to that reason, her meal offering is burned, because once an offering has been properly sanctified, it cannot be deconsecrated. But if you say that the bitter water does not evaluate whether she was unfaithful, so long as there are witnesses somewhere in the world to her infidelity, then once the witnesses come forth, the matter should be revealed retroactively that when the meal offering was sanctified at the outset, it was sanctified in error, and the meal offering should therefore be transferred to non-sacred status rather than being burned. Now, in answer to this argument, Rav Yehuda from Diskarta said, that the Mishna concerning meal offerings is referring to a case where the woman committed adultery in the temple courtyard. What? Now they're saying, no, we're not talking about whether she originally committed adultery when she was warned not to seclude herself with some man that the husband was suspicious of, and then she secluded herself with that man anyway, but rather, when she did that, she became a Sotah, and then the husband and wife were prohibited to each other, went up to Jerusalem along with their chaperones, so that they would not be with each other, until the bitter water had been drunk. And during that period of time, and not only during that period of time on the way to Jerusalem, and not only in Jerusalem, but in the temple itself, this wanton woman committed adultery there in the temple. This is, it's like impossible to imagine that such a thing could happen, but it's not completely impossible. It's somewhere in the realm of possibility. And they're just accounting for that possibility. That somehow happened, right? And it's one of these very weird liminal cases that doesn't really matter whether or not it could happen in the real world, practically speaking, but it allows us to test our understanding of the law. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda from Diskarta, is introducing this idea. So, it's referring to a case where the woman committed adultery in the temple courtyard after the meal offering had been sanctified in a service vessel. As at the outset, when the meal offering was sanctified, due to her previous seclusion, it was properly sanctified, as the witnesses were to the infidelity that occurred in the temple courtyard, not to the original infidelity that she was suspected of. So Rav Misharshia objects to this explanation. But how can she commit adultery in the temple courtyard? Don't young priests accompany her to the place where she drinks the bitter water? She's never alone. She's never secluded. She's never in a secret place where this could happen. And the Gemara answers, well, this is a case where she committed adultery with the young priests themselves. Again, not because this ever really happened, but what if that happened? So Rav Ashi said differently. It is a case where she needed to relieve herself. She went to the bathroom, and the accompanying young priest allowed her to go to relieve herself in private, and she committed adultery there. For is that to say that the young priests hold her in a cell? Since there are times when she is out of their sight, there remains the possibility that she will commit adultery with others who are not priests, who just happen to be there, even when accompanied by the young priests. So Rav Papa said differently. Actually, the explanation is, as we initially said, that the witnesses testify that she had been defiled during her initial seclusion that she was suspected of, for which she must drink the water, and not for some other adultery committed later and in the temple courtyard. And that which you say, that if the bitter water does not evaluate a woman with whom there are witnesses concerning her infidelity, right? The waters don't work if witnesses exist somewhere who just haven't come forward yet. And therefore the offering was sanctified in error, and it should be transferred to non-sacred status. You are correct that by Torah law it is non-sacred. However, it is considered sacred by rabbinic law, due to a rabbinic decree, lest people who do not know that sanctification was done in error and will mistakenly say that one can transfer a meal offering to non-sacred status without it being redeemed even after it had been sanctified in a service vessel, right? So by Torah law, an offering that had become sanctified by being placed in a sacred vessel inside the holy temple cannot be deconsecrated unless it was placed in the vessel in error, in which case it can be deconsecrated. But by rabbinic law, we don't allow that because people will see it and they'll think, oh, well, if you change your mind after you put it into a service vessel, you can deconsecrate it. No, you can't change your mind if you did it properly when you first put it in. It's just that if it went in error, as a matter of Torah law, it could be deconsecrated, but as a matter of rabbinic law, policy, to avoid people making that mistake, they don't allow it to come back out. Once it's consecrated in the service vessel, if it can't be brought to the altar, it's going to be burned, not deconsecrated. Now, Rav Mari raises an objection to Rav Papa's interpretation from a Baraisa in the Tosefta, which states, if the meal offering of a Sotah became ritually impure, its status is determined by when it became impure. If it became impure, now impure could be like a dead creeping thing fell into it, right? And that would render it impure and disqualify it from being brought on the altar or being eaten by priests. Now it's not that somebody did something wrong, it's just an accident happened and it became tameh, it became impure and therefore unfit for the altar, unfit for priests. So if it became impure before it was sanctified by being placed in the service vessel, well, then it is like all other meal offerings that became impure prior to sanctification, and it should be redeemed. It was consecrated in the sense that it was set aside, right? That's why I can't just go back to the store, as it were. And now that it's been consecrated, it needs to be redeemed and replaced, right, by an offering that has not become impure. So it is like all other meal offerings that became impure prior to sanctification, and it should be redeemed by a replacement offering brought in its stead. If it became impure after it had been sanctified by being placed in a service vessel, then it is like all other meal offerings that became impure after sanctification, and it must be burned. Now the Baraisa continues, if after the meal offering was sanctified by being placed in a service vessel, the priest removed a handful from it to be sacrificed on the altar, and the handful was sanctified by being placed in its own service vessel, but the priest did not manage to sacrifice it before he, the husband, died. Right? If the husband, like imagine the husband has a heart attack and drops dead at the temple when they're in the middle of the procedure. They've brought the meal offering, she hasn't drunk the bitter water yet, and now the husband dies. Once the husband is dead, she doesn't drink the bitter water. Right? The purpose of the bitter water is to make her permitted to her husband. Now that he's dead, there's no point in the procedure stops. Okay, she's not going to drink the bitter water. What about the meal offering that was placed in the service vessel? And even the special handful of it that's going to go up on the altar had been placed in its own service vessel. And then the husband dies. What do we do with that? It's right. So by being placed in its own service vessel, but the priest did not manage to sacrifice it before he, the husband, died, or before she, the wife, died, rendering the offering irrelevant. Then it is like all other meal offerings that are invalidated between the removal of the handful and its being sacrificed. And can you guess what happens to it? It must be burned. So the Baraisa continues that the handful was sacrificed, but the priest did not manage to eat the remainder of the meal offering before the husband died or before the wife died. It is like all other meal offerings that became invalidated after the handful had been sacrificed, and it must be eaten by the priest. And the Baraisa explains why, despite the death of the husband or the wife, which renders this meal offering irrelevant, as the woman will not drink the bitter water, the meal offering is still eaten, because this meal offering initially came due to an uncertainty as to whether the woman had been unfaithful, and it atoned for its uncertainty and left, i.e., it fulfilled its purpose of being sacrificed at the time when the husband and the wife were still alive. So that meal offering, the part of the meal offering that's for the priest to eat, it completed its journey, as it were, and so it is eaten by the priest. So the Brisa continues, if witnesses came forth before the handful was offered and testified with regard to her that she is defiled, her meal offering is burned. If the witnesses who testified about her infidelity are later found to be liars, conspiring witnesses, her meal offering is transferred to non-sacred status. The final clause teaches that if the witnesses to the wife's infidelity are found to be conspiring witnesses, then the meal offering is transferred to non-sacred status, even after it was already sanctified in a service vessel. Now, this is difficult for Rav Papa, for he said that in a similar case where witnesses testified about her infidelity, after the offering was sanctified, the sages decreed that the offering should be burned in order to prevent people from saying that a meal offering that has been sanctified in a service vessel may be deconsecrated. So now we're saying, yeah, you are going to deconsecrate, because in this case, the witnesses who said that she was, committed adultery, the witnesses turn out to be liars. So she doesn't have, perhaps it's proven that they're liars before she drinks the bitter water, so she doesn't need to drink the bitter water. And what are we going to do with the meal offering? It's not burned because it wasn't done in, it's not set, it was sanctified and for good purpose when there was uncertainty, but now it's not necessary, so she didn't do anything wrong, so I guess it gets deconsecrated in that situation. But the Gemara refutes this objection. Do you say that one can question Rav Papa's statement from a ruling concerning conspiring witnesses? The cases are not comparable, as conspiring witnesses generate publicity. Since the circumstances of these cases are well publicized, everyone knows that the offering was sanctified in error, and that's why we'll allow it to become deconsecrated even by rabbinic law. Whereas in other cases where people might, onlookers might think that something went into a service vessel, was consecrated, was sanctified, and then they took it out and deconsecrated it, that's just always permissible rather than only in cases of error. That's where the rabbinic decree applies, and we're going to burn it rather than deconsecrate it. After attempting to question Rav Shesh's novel ruling that in the case of a Sotah, with regard to whom there are witnesses in a country overseas who can testify that she engaged in sexual intercourse, that in those cases the bitter water does not evaluate whether she was unfaithful or not, the Gemara attempts to adduce support for his ruling. It is taught in a Baraisa, in accordance with the opinion of Rav Shesh's, but not due to his reasoning, rather based upon an explication of a verse. Right now we're back to Rav Shesh's idea that the bitter waters don't work if there are witnesses somewhere that could testify that she was unfaithful and that she would survive the ordeal, not because she's innocent, but because the waters don't work when there's another way to prove whether she was unfaithful. So now we're going to do proof for that. Not according to Rav Shesh's reasoning, but a different route to the same result. The Bryce expounds several words in the verse concerning a Sotah who survives the drinking of the bitter water and is found to have been faithful. And if the woman be not defiled, but be clean, then she shall be cleared and shall conceive seed. She'll become pregnant. That's Numbers 5:28. Now, noting that the phrase, but be clean, is apparently redundant, right? It already said she's innocent. She was not defiled. What are we adding by the words, she is clean? What are we adding with that, right? The usage of the word clean, tahora, in the verse, pure, in the verse indicates that the only one who survived the drinking of the bitter water due to her fidelity will conceive a child, but this will not happen in a case where she did not die because there are witnesses for her in a country overseas who can testify that she engaged in sexual intercourse. Additionally, from the additional letter vav in the word utahora, and she is clean, or but she is clean, another case is excluded. Only one who survived the drinking of the bitter water due to her fidelity will conceive a child, but this will not happen in a case where merit delays punishment for her, and she consequently doesn't die immediately after drinking the bitter water. I'm almost done. Got questions or comments? Get them in. So the Brisa continues. The next word in the verse, she, right? She in Hebrew is he. One of those things. So the word he, which means she, excludes a third case, but not where she, i.e. her infidelity, is discussed by weavers in the moonlight. What is weavers in the moonlight? This refers to common knowledge, right? There aren't two witnesses who are going to come forward and testify against her, but it's one of those situations where everybody knows that she did it. And the phrase for that is where her infidelity is discussed by weavers in the moonlight, meaning the women who are working long hours and weaving in the moonlight, right? Still weaving at night, and they're like the town gossips, I guess. And if they know, everybody knows, right? Women would sit in groups while spinning thread in the moonlight and gossip about the goings-on in the city. If they discuss her having committed adultery, then it is considered public knowledge. And the bitter water would not evaluate her in that case, as evaluation is not needed. Everyone knows she's an adulteress. Now, after citing this baraisa as proof for the ruling of Rav Sheshes, albeit from a different source, the Gemara questions how Rabbi Shimon could deny the ability of the woman's merit to delay the Sotah punishment due to fear that it will discredit the whole Sotah ritual. Being that there is another case that prevents the bitter water from evaluating a woman, i.e. where witnesses in a country overseas are able to testify. And Rabbi Shimon granted that he does not interpret the letter Vav, as he holds that its addition is not significant, and therefore he holds that her merit does not delay her punishment. But there is the case where there are witnesses for her in a country overseas who can testify she engaged in sexual intercourse, when the bitter water will not evaluate her faithfulness. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon should be concerned that such a dispensation will result in the defamation of the untainted women who drank and were unaffected, and people will view them as guilty women who were not affected because there were witnesses overseas. And the Gemara answers, the case of witnesses in a country overseas is not common, and therefore no one will assume that that is the reason why women in the normal course of things who drank the bitter water and were not affected, that's the reason they're actually guilty, but there's witnesses somewhere else. People won't make that assumption, so those women won't be defamed. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Tomorrow we'll pick that up on page 7a with Mishnah number 3. But first we'll read the final passage of Tractate Nazir and make a siyum on Tractate Nazir, and then have a little l'chaim and a snack. Kosher for Passover snack. And then if you are firstborn and celebrating the completion of a tractate, you don't have to fast on Erev Pesach, the day before Passover begins that night. We're going to do that tomorrow at 10 a.m. Special time. Our class tomorrow is 10 a.m. Pacific. All right, let me check if there's any questions. Nina is way too busy inside, so she's not passing me questions. I'm going to check the comments myself. Lynn is heading into the search for chametz in another half hour. What a busy night. Thanks for keeping the Talmud flowing. And Marjorie, refuah shlema for your uncle. That's answering Joe, whose prayers for my uncle just coming out of a coma. So Yosef, may your uncle have a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery. And we say amen. That seems to be all the comments and questions today that I can see. My friends, see you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific special time, early in the day, because it's Erev Pesach, and we'll make a siyum on Tractate Nazir and then read page 7 here in Tractate Sotah.